Apple didn't just let the iPhone 4S die off like they do with most of their old devices. They absolutely murdered it. This was the cliche line I opened up with when I essentially did this same video last year. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and today we're revisiting the story of the iPhone 4S and how Apple took a device used and loved by millions and absolutely ruined it. The iPhone 4S isn't the only device Apple has killed. I would say both the first and second iPhones are pretty darn slow on their final firmwares, but they were also slow in the first place, so I don't know if that really counts. I would say the iPhone 3GS turned out really well on iOS 6. The iPhone 4 was pretty bad on iOS 7, but improved with iOS 7.1 to at least somewhat usable. The iPhone 4S, on the other hand, is just hot garbage with iOS 9.3.5, its latest update, or previously latest update, as it did receive 9.3.6 in 2019. The hot garbage extends to the iPod 5th generation, iPad 2nd generation, iPad 3rd generation, and iPad mini 1st generation. What do all these devices have in common? They're all on iOS 9 and feature Apple's A5 chipset, a processor that, while it might be dual-core, cannot whatsoever handle iOS 9, and one that even struggled to run iOS 8. The iPhone 4S and its A5 siblings are all brutally slow, despite them being some of the best and most successful Apple products ever made. The first iPad mini, that thing did really well. iPod Touch 5, that was hugely popular and sold for years. The second generation iPad, probably the most successful iPad to date, and it was a huge deal when it came out. The third generation iPad bombed pretty hard, actually, and it was only available for like 6 months before Apple stopped selling it, so we don't talk about that one, but yeah, getting it to iOS 9 was kind of just like rubbing salt in the wound there. The iPhone 4S, an iconic piece in Apple history for introducing Siri, as well as one of the biggest, if not the biggest, leaps in camera technology Apple's ever made. I wanted to come back to this subject because I don't think it's one we should forget. Apple has made some great strides to make sure that this never happens again. And I think iOS 12 and 13 have shown that Apple is doing things right, finally. The iPhone 4S is really, really, really bad, and Apple cannot let that happen again. So I think I've made the answer to the title pretty clear. How Apple killed the 4S, well, they gave it iOS 9, and iOS 9 is slow. But what I haven't talked about yet is just how slow this thing actually is. Almost anything you do is unbearable. Swiping around the UI is the most basic thing you can do on a phone, and it should be what is the fastest on a phone, but it isn't here. Swiping up the control center, swiping down the notification bar, trying to get the keyboard up. The keyboard can take like 3 seconds to appear, 5 seconds to appear. These sound like minor things, but that time adds up, and it's a huge pain. When it comes to running apps on the 4S, it actually depends on the app. Some, like Netflix, believe it or not, are actually not too bad, while others, like YouTube, are a guaranteed crash. By Apple giving the 4S an extra year with iOS 9, you have the case where a lot of apps want to push phones further. They want to use more of your system memory, more processing power. But when it comes to phones like the 4S or the iPad 2, they just can't handle it. So developers are forced to either have a dumbed down experience for everybody, or just make the app the way they want it. And maybe it's going to be slow on older devices, but sucks to suck. Now, this isn't always the case, and there are developers who are thoughtful enough to optimize apps for older devices, because that is possible. But still, it should not have gone this far, and it forced users who use the iPhone 4S to get a slower experience across the board, whether it be around the UI or even in other apps. This is how Apple killed the 4S. They gave it too much support, and it slowed down to the point that it's practically unusable. Before I get commenters saying, hey, I use the iPhone 4S on iOS 9 and it's great, you're wrong, it's fast, it's a great phone. Look, if you're somehow using the 4S on iOS 9, that's great. Props to you. Buy a better phone. I kid, obviously not everyone can just buy a better phone, but the truth is Apple screwed you over here. The 4S should perform better than it does on iOS 9, and there's no point pretending that isn't true, because it is. So if you still think the 4S on iOS 9 is a good thing, or that it's fast, or even remotely usable, you're wrong. I'm right. Trust me, I'm a guy with a YouTube channel and merch now, so therefore I am reputable, and trustworthy. The iPhone 4S is slow and no one should ever have to use it. Don't believe me? Well, last year I tried to use it for a full week. That's right, in 2018 I moved from an iPhone XS to the iPhone 4S for an entire week. I'm basically a guy who did something that isn't actually probably that hard, all things considered, for a full week. I mean, it was tough. Look, words are failing me here. Basically, it wasn't a fun time, but I did learn something from that, and that's that I don't need my phone that much. Social media was not as much of a time waster in my day. I wasn't spending a lot of time on Instagram, Twitter, or Reddit, you know, the usual things. These habits of ours with social media and whatnot almost turn into an addiction. And going to the iPhone 4S actually helped me recover. I spent less time looking at my small, tiny screen and more time looking at my bigger PC screen because, who am I kidding? I don't have a life. But enough about me, let's start at the beginning here. 2011. The iPhone 4S is launched. It has that same beautiful display as the iPhone 4, a much improved camera, Siri, who at the time was miles ahead of anything you could somewhat even consider competition, the first dual-core processor in an iPhone with the A5 chip, and a decent revamp of the software in iOS 5. While people were a bit disappointed in the lack of external changes from the iPhone 4 as it looked exactly the same, it was actually a pretty solid upgrade, all things considered. Likely one of the best S upgrades Apple has ever made. Skip a year and we get iOS 6. Still, all is good, the 4S is fast. Another year goes by and the infamous iOS 7 comes out. iOS 7 changes up the entire experience, but unlike the iPhone 4, the 4S was actually capable of running it. It wasn't fast, mind you, but it wasn't slow either, and most tasks ran pretty well. Plus, this gave 4S users the new design that pretty much everyone wanted back in the day, and so everyone wins. Skip a year and iOS 8 comes out. To the surprise of nobody, the 4S gets the update. The reason this is a surprise to no one is because the iPhone 4 got iOS 7, and therefore the 4S should get another version, and it did. iOS 8 was pretty bad on the 4S. It isn't as bad as a certain newer OS, but it was slow. RAM management wasn't good. The 4S just didn't have enough RAM to work with in the first place, and this extended to all other A5 devices. The only device with an A5 chipset and a full gigabyte of RAM as opposed to 512 megabytes was the iPad 3. However, the iPad 3 had a Retina display, and because it was a big display, there was a lot of pixels to push, and that took a lot of the processing power, thus making the iPad 3 slow. The iPad 3 was just an all-round disaster. If I do ever make a video on the worst iPad ever, I, spoiler alert, guarantee that the iPad 3 will be taking the crown. So across the board, all these devices were pretty slow. iOS 7 already hadn't been amazing, but Apple had to update them. After all, you always need to get another version of the previous iPhone, right? This now, of course, has changed, and I'll get to that, but I think that was the mindset back then. There was positives of the iPhone 4S getting iOS 8. It was another year of support, which was helpful for a lot of people. So the iPhone 4S, although it was already slow on iOS 8, was doing just fine. It made sense for Apple to update it, and I don't think anybody was complaining, even if it was kinda slow. But then a year later, iOS 9 came out, and to the surprise of me at the time, the 4S among all other A5 devices was able to update. Apple had no requirement to do this, if that makes sense, as the 4S had already gotten one more update over the iPhone 4, but they did it anyway. And as a result, soon millions of people with the 4S were presented with a nearly unusable experience. iOS 9 is horribly slow. It was never a good update, even for newer phones like the iPhone 5. My best guess as to why Apple updated it is because they thought that the 4S was capable on a technical level, given that its processor was dual-core. But in practice, this was a horrible choice. I don't know if Apple didn't test it properly first or what, but suffice to say, people weren't too happy on iOS 9, and for very, very good reason. Giving an update because a phone is technically capable isn't a bad practice, and in fact, it's one I wish more smartphone makers would follow. The Samsung Galaxy S8 isn't getting Android 10. That's right, a phone from 2017 is already going to be unsupported. The S8 is more than capable of running Android 10. Apple giving the 4S iOS 9 because it was technically capable with a dual-core processor isn't a bad idea in theory. And they did a similar thing in giving iOS 12 to the iPhone 5S because it was 64-bit and thus could run iOS 12. However, there's a difference. The 5S could handle iOS 12. In fact, if anything, iOS 12 was actually faster than iOS 11. You could not say the same thing with the 4S and iOS 9. The iOS 8 update made sense because Apple had the arbitrary reasoning that a phone needed at least one more year of support than the previous model. But giving it an extra year was out of character and completely unnecessary. It wasn't unprecedented, as the 3GS got to iOS 6 as opposed to the 3G on iOS 4, and of course again later the 5S got iOS 12, while the 5 and 5C were stuck on iOS 10. Again though, the 5S actually worked out, and so did the 3GS. There was no reason to update it to iOS 9. I know I've said this already, but it's true. Yes, it meant an extra year of support for users, and longer app support, new features, etc. I'm not going to pretend there weren't benefits to iOS 9, because there were, but why? They didn't need to do it. Part of the problem here is that Apple doesn't let you roll back iOS versions. If they gave you longer updates, but you could still go back if they were too slow, then it would all be fine. But they don't. If you update, you've updated forever. That's it. Last year, this actually changed. Apple opened up iOS 6.1.3 for the 4S, which means you could actually roll back to iOS 6. But recently, Apple changed this, and it's no longer working again, so you're stuck on iOS 9. There are runarounds to get to iOS 6.1.3 and iOS 8 for that matter, but they aren't official, and they definitely are not encouraged by Apple. Them opening up iOS 6 for the 4S, at least to me, seems kind of like an admission of guilt. Like, hey, yeah, your phone is really slow, but if you really want to, you can go back in time to iOS 6. And yet, with them closing it down, now I really don't know what to think. And also, why did they do it in the first place again? Where am I going with all this? Well, beyond saying, oh yeah, Apple screwed over the consumer, I think it's important to understand their mindset back then as well as their mindset now. Or their assumed mindset, as we actually don't know what they're thinking and what happens behind closed doors. I'm of the opinion that Apple looked at the 4S, said, hey, it's technically capable, so let's give it the update. The flip side of that coin and the counter-argument is that this was planned obsolescence, and that Apple actually purposely slows down their phones with updates so that you have to buy a new one. I would argue this has been heavily debunked by iOS 12, going to the 5S, and being a huge performance boost across the board for all iPhones. That's pretty straightforward, and I've talked about it before, but now let's talk about the phone that some people are probably wondering my thoughts on, and that's the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus. The iPhone 6 was dropped support for with the launch of iOS 13, and just like the year-older 5S is stuck on iOS 12. Some might say, aha, see, Apple doesn't care about their consumers. The iPhone 6 and 6 Plus were the best-selling smartphones of all time, and yet has already lost support. Here's the thing, the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus really weren't a whole lot better than the 5S. They were bigger, but beyond that, they had the same amount of RAM, and the processor actually wasn't much faster. So ending it on iOS 12 is actually a really good sign. Apple has moved on from the former mindset that every single phone has to have at least one version over the prior, assuming that is indeed how they wanted to do things. The iPhone 6 still got 5 years of support, which is way better than any Android ever does, and best of all, it landed on a version it actually feels spiffy on. iOS 13 would have slowed it down, and that's something I think Apple did right in avoiding. Okay, let's take a breath here. Apple done goofed when they gave the A5 devices iOS 9, but why am I reading into this so much? I think the whole 4S debacle actually marked a turning point in how Apple treats their old legacy devices. First, the 4S in and of itself was a pretty impressive feat, considering it was supported all the way from late 2011 to late 2016. That's pretty awesome. As mentioned earlier, there are some benefits to having the 4S on iOS 9, and some would argue that maybe Apple didn't kill it after all. Those people probably haven't used a 4S because it's really slow, but hey, I kind of see their point. You get an extra year of app support. Even now, some apps are still supported on iOS 9. You got all the new features. You got new security updates, which is always good. It's a good thing when Apple gives their phones extra support, but the 4S was just a terrible choice when it came to getting iOS 9. It just wasn't capable. I've said it a million times, but that's how Apple killed the iPhone 4S. Either they overestimated its ability to run iOS 9, or they purposely wanted to slow it down for their users. I kind of doubt that's the case, but it is possible. What I find so interesting about this is that Apple killed the iPhone 4S in a way you wouldn't expect. They didn't end support early. They didn't send out an update that completely breaks your phone. Instead, they updated it, and actually, in a lot of ways, made it better, at least on the surface. That's how they ruined the 4S. They tried to make it better. That is what's so interesting about this to me, and maybe I'm crazy. I probably am crazy. I'm filming this at 2 a.m., so that's not a good sign. All in all, the iPhone 4S had its ups and downs, and while it was one of the most innovative iPhones ever, I mean, Siri was a huge deal. Siri might be kind of useless now, especially compared to Google Assistant, but back then, Siri was insanely cool. You had the 8-megapixel camera. You still had the classic iconic design of the iPhone 4. The 4S was a great great phone in 2011, and it's a pity that it's not a great phone anymore. It irks me a lot that Apple doesn't have a way to go back to older versions of iOS, because if they did, this phone still could be at least somewhat usable for some people. And I mean, it is somewhat usable for some people, in part thanks to iOS 9, but it's so slow, and all those people are going to be having a rough time with it simply because it's a painful experience. Apple killed the iPhone 4S. They murdered it. It was them. Yes, it would have died at some point thanks to time and how technology improves, but Apple sped up that process pretty quickly. And with that, I think I'm pretty much done here. The 4S has always been one of my favorite phones, and did you ever own one? What do you think of the 4S? Did Apple kill it, or am I completely crazy? Let me know in the comments down below. If you found this video interesting somehow, maybe hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this. You can follow me over on Twitter and Instagram at 91_tech, and make sure you join the Discord, link in the description, and merch, come on, just go buy my merch. I mean, I'm not asking that much of you, right? Discount codes and links in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. This video might have seemed a little bit rambly, but I am genuinely interested in this kind of stuff, which says a lot about me. But anyways, again, thanks for watching. I'm Josh from 91tech, and I will see you all next time.